27 years ago, a respected pastor vanished from his church one rainy night, leaving behind no trace except a hallway security clip showing him exiting empty-handed, then returning minutes later with a suitcase. He walked out again. This time, he never came back. What followed was a trail of buried secrets, hidden maps, and a desperate girl who might be his daughter, leading to a truth no one in Greystone was prepared to face. It was a bitter winter night in Greystone, a quiet town in upstate New York where the wind always seemed to carry whispers of stories better left untold. The frost clung stubbornly to every window pane, and the streets, already dusted with snow, glistened under the faint glow of amber street lamps. St. Jude's Church stood tall in the middle of town, a building as old as the town itself, its stone walls hiding generations of secrets within. Inside, the sanctuary was still and dimly lit, its wooden pews echoing softly with the creaks of age and silence. At the heart of the building, nestled behind the chancel and through a narrow hallway, was the pastor's residence, humble, sparsely furnished, yet perfectly sufficient for Reverend Ethan Harper, the man the townsfolk trusted with their sins and their sorrows. At precisely 2:13 a.m., the silent hallway camera, installed just 6 months earlier after a string of petty thefts, captured movement. Reverend Harper appeared in frame, wearing his usual flannel robe, walking calmly out of his private quarters. In his hand, nothing. His posture was relaxed, almost meditative, like a man rising in the dead of night, simply to clear his mind or pray. There was no sound, of course. The footage had no audio, but the motion-activated light flickered on as he passed beneath it, casting a pale halo on his thinning gray hair and tired, lined face. 14 minutes later he returned. This time he was dragging a large black suitcase on wheels, scuffed, heavy-looking, the kind used for international travel. The camera caught him pausing briefly outside his door. He adjusted his grip on the hallway, then vanished into the room. The light above flickered again, then steadied, then went dark. That was the last recorded sighting of Reverend Ethan Harper. The following morning, Miss Abigail, the church's secretary who had faithfully opened the office every weekday for 12 years, arrived at 7:52 a.m. She noticed the pastor's car, an old beige Subaru, still parked outside in the same spot. She thought nothing of it. The Reverend often walked around the block in the mornings to collect his thoughts, he'd say. But when the church remained locked past 8, she began to worry. He always unlocked it first. Always. By 10, with still no sign of him and his phone going straight to voicemail, Abigail contacted the deacon, Mr. Willard, who promptly arrived and forced entry into the pastor's quarters. The room was pristine, bed made, Bible placed precisely on the nightstand, rosary looped around it. No signs of struggle or sudden departure. But the closet door was wide open, and inside every item of clothing was still hanging neatly. Every item, except for a long black overcoat and a leather satchel, usually kept on the bottom shelf. They called the police. Officer Marla Jenkins was first on scene. She reviewed the footage. Her brow furrowed at the sight of the returning Ethan pulling the suitcase, especially when they realized that no such item had ever been seen in his possession before. There was no suitcase like it anywhere in the room, nor in the building, nor in the car. Where had it come from? The footage showed no other entries or exits that night. No visitors, no deliveries, no prior suitcase in frame, just Ethan, leaving empty-handed and returning with a mysterious piece of luggage. The suitcase and Ethan Harper were both gone by sunrise. Rumors began almost immediately. He ran away with a woman, one said. He was in trouble, gambling maybe, said another. No, whispered an older congregant. It's got something to do with the basement. I heard something strange down there 2 nights ago. Most brushed off the gossip, but the seed of suspicion had been planted, and it grew quickly in the silence of uncertainty. Detective Ray Leland from the county sheriff's office took over the investigation. A stoic man in his late 50s, Ray was not easily rattled, but something about the whole thing disturbed him. Maybe it was the way everything had been left in perfect order, or the absence of even a note. People who planned to leave usually left behind some kind of trail. Ethan left only mystery. But with no brand visible in the footage and no record of any recent purchase or delivery to Ethan's name, there was nothing to go on. Church members described Ethan as frugal, almost minimalist. He didn't travel. He didn't even own a passport, according to records. So why, on a freezing Tuesday night, did he leave his room and return with something no one had ever seen before? A search of the church building turned up nothing, not in the office, not in the basement, not in the bell tower. No signs of struggle, no notes, no indication of why a beloved pastor with a spotless reputation would vanish in the middle of the night. Just one eerie clip of security footage and a timeline that made no sense. By week's end, the town had shifted from worry to fascination. The church locked its door to fascination. The church locked its door to but some noticed the locks had been changed, that the office lights stayed on late into the night, that unfamiliar cars came and went from the lot. In the center of it all remained the silence of Ethan's disappearance, and the suitcase. Always the suitcase. No one could say where it came from or where it went, but something about it gnawed at everyone who watched that video. What could have been inside that made a man like Ethan Harper step out into the cold and walk away from everything he'd ever known? By Wednesday morning, the buzz around Reverend Harper's disappearance had reached a low hum of quiet panic within the church leadership. The church board had decided to keep things discreet for now, no official statement to the congregation yet, no press involved, not until they had something more solid than a man vanishing with a suitcase. So while the police continued their procedural inquiries, it fell to Gerald Simmons, the church's longtime caretaker and building manager, to perform his usual rounds and secure the premises. Gerald was a methodical man, a retired firefighter with a limp in his right leg and a deep sense of duty. He had shown up that morning earlier than usual, hoping to gather the maintenance logs and perhaps find something, anything, that could explain where Ethan had gone. The sanctuary was quiet, its pews bathed in the pale morning light that filtered through stained glass. Everything looked undisturbed at first glance, but as Gerald made his way to the back corridor near the utility rooms, he noticed something off. The door to the basement, an old reinforced wooden door at the end of a narrow passage, was not just unlocked, it was slightly ajar. This door was always kept bolted. Church policy, written and unwritten, required it. The basement beneath St. Jude's was not meant for casual use. It was cramped, uneven, full of old piping and structural quirks, and most importantly, it had been deemed unsafe by an inspector 3 years ago, following a minor flood that left the foundation slightly compromised. No one had used it since, and Gerald himself had the only known key. But here it was, open an inch, like someone had entered, or perhaps left, and not bothered to secure it. Instinctively, Gerald reached for his key ring and tried the lock. It clicked, but the bolt was already retracted. Swallowing a strange sense of unease, he pulled the door open wider and peered down into the dark stairwell. The scent that drifted up was musty, familiar, old wood, mold-damp stone, but there was something else, a sharp tang he couldn't place. He flipped the stairwell light, but the bulb at the base didn't turn on. Grumbling, Gerald reached into the hallway closet for a flashlight and descended slowly. The stairs creaked under his weight, and the beam of light darted across cobwebs, stacked folding chairs, and a collection of rusty filing cabinets from the 1970s. Not just any boots, heavy, wide-soled, the kind Ethan always wore. They led from the stairs toward the far wall where an old utility cabinet stood. Gerald followed them and noticed something else odd. The cabinet was slightly crooked, pushed just a few inches off its normal alignment. When he tugged at it, the entire unit shifted more easily than expected, revealing a narrow crack in the wall behind it. Not a full passageway, but definitely a breach. Maybe an old access point, maybe just a structural flaw, but something someone could have squeezed through if they were desperate enough. Gerald exhaled sharply and backed away. He didn't enter the breach. He didn't need to. What bothered him more was how deliberate it all felt. He returned upstairs with a growing knot in his stomach. He locked the basement door, double-checked it, and made a mental note to inform the deacon. But before leaving the rear corridor, he remembered something else on his checklist, delivering the previous Sunday's attendance records from Ethan's office to the treasurer. The pastor's study was small, tucked behind the sanctuary, and decorated with sparse furniture and decades of church memorabilia, framed certificates, old sermon notes, and maps, lots of maps. Ethan had a quiet obsession with topography. He used maps in his sermons often, tying geography to theology in poetic ways. Gerald opened the office door and stepped inside. At first glance, everything looked neat, but as he moved toward the file cabinet, his eyes landed on the wall behind the pastor's desk. Something was missing. The frame that usually held a detailed relief map of the Adirondack Mountains, Ethan's favorite, was empty. The frame hung crooked, as if the map had been torn out in haste. Curious, Gerald checked the nearby bookshelf and drawers. Nothing. The map was gone, and it wasn't just any map. It had been annotated over the years with red ink. Ethan had marked trails, isolated cabins, elevation notes, even penciled scriptures along the ridge lines. It wasn't valuable in any monetary sense, but it had been personal, intimate. Why take that and only that? Gerald found no other signs of disturbance. No drawers ransacked, no open files, no indication of someone leaving in a rush, except that missing map. A shiver crawled down his spine. The office felt different somehow, like a space recently inhabited by someone trying not to leave a trace. He stepped back into the hallway, closing the door behind him more firmly than necessary. Something was wrong. Ethan's disappearance hadn't been an accident, nor an impulse. There was intent, precision. That map, those boot prints, the open basement, the missing suitcase, none of it was random. Later that afternoon, Detective Ray Leland returned to the church for follow-up questioning and found Gerald waiting near the sacristy. When told about the basement door and the missing map, Ray's expression turned hard. He asked for access to the basement immediately. This time, he brought backup. The police descended with high-powered flashlights, marking the footprints and inspecting the shifted cabinet. They took samples of dust and mold, photos of the wall breach, and carefully bagged a few fibers stuck to a protruding nail. When they emerged, Ray pulled Gerald aside and asked if there were any security cameras near the basement corridor. Gerald shook his head slowly. Only the hallway upstairs, that one, he nodded toward the lower level, was never installed. Ray didn't respond immediately. He stared down the staircase one more time, then turned and climbed back into the sanctuary, his boots thudding softly against the old floorboards. He walked up the center aisle and stopped at the pulpit, gazing out over the rows of pews, his thoughts a million miles away. 3 days had passed since Reverend Ethan Harper vanished, and the tension inside the Harper household had congealed into something dense and uncomfortable. Julia Harper, Ethan's wife of 27 years, sat at the kitchen table in their modest home just outside of town, her fingers tracing the rim of a cold coffee mug. She hadn't slept much. The nights were the worst, too quiet, too still, too full of unanswered questions. When Ethan didn't come home that first day, Julia hadn't panicked. It wasn't unusual for him to stay at the church overnight if he had counseling sessions or sermon prep, but when the second day passed without a call and his phone continued to go straight to voicemail, she called the police and filed a missing persons report. By then, the rumor mill had already started churning, and what the authorities discovered next only deepened the mystery. Detective Ray Leland, now handling the case full-time, met Julia in the living room on Friday morning. His face, lined and weathered, was composed but alert as he delivered the first real update. "Mrs. Harper," he said gently, "we checked Ethan's financials. Around 3:04 a.m. on the night he disappeared, a withdrawal of $3,000, 0 cents, was made from his personal checking account." Julia blinked. $3,000? She repeated, confused. Ethan doesn't carry more than $30 on him. He hates ATMs. Ray nodded. That's what made it stand out. It was withdrawn from a machine 2 miles from the church, 24-hour gas station near the bypath. "That's not on his way home," she said softly. "He never goes that direction." "Exactly," Ray said, showing her a printed receipt with the timestamp and terminal ID. "We're pulling surveillance from the gas station, but it might take a day or two." Julia swallowed hard. It wasn't just the money. It was the timing. 3:04 a.m., less than an hour after he was seen returning to his room with that suitcase. What could he need cash for at that hour? That night, unable to sleep and haunted by questions, Julia went to Ethan's study, a small room at the back of their house he'd used for theological reading and writing since the kids left for college. She hadn't touched anything in there yet, out of respect, or maybe denial. But now, something urged her forward. She turned on the lamp beside his desk and sat down in the worn leather chair. The room smelled faintly of cedar and aftershave, the familiar scent of her husband, Books were stacked neatly on the shelves, some bookmarked with receipts and torn church bulletins. She opened the top drawer. Notebooks, pens, a few letters. Nothing out of place. But something about the desk itself felt unsettled. The desk had a glass top, under which Ethan often kept photos, snapshots from missions abroad, postcards from old congregants, yellowing flyers from revival events. Julia lifted the glass panel to straighten a corner that had curled. As she adjusted the edge, she noticed a slip of color wedged between the photo of their anniversary trip to Maine and a church newsletter. It looked like another picture, but it wasn't one she recognized. Carefully, she pulled it out. It was a photograph, clearly old, slightly faded, the corners curled. It showed Ethan, younger by at least 10 years, standing beside a man she had never seen before. The setting was outdoors, wooded, remote, possibly a cabin or campsite. Both men looked relaxed, even happy. Ethan wore hiking gear, and the other man, slightly taller and darker-skinned, had his arm casually slung around Ethan's shoulders. There was no writing on the back. No date, no location, no clue. But Julia's stomach dropped. She didn't recognize the man at all. Ethan had never mentioned him. In all their years together, she thought she knew every significant figure in his life, but the intimacy in the photo, how closely they stood, how natural they looked together, was undeniable. She sat back in the chair, the photo trembling in her hands. Who was this man, and why had Ethan hidden the photo under the glass rather than placing it among the others? The next day, Julia brought the photo to Ray. He studied it carefully, then excused himself and returned minutes later with a printout. "We ran a facial recognition scan," he explained, placing the two side by side. "The man next to Ethan is James Curran, former wilderness counselor at a private youth rehabilitation center in the Catskills, closed down around 2004 after several lawsuits. Records show Ethan did volunteer work there during seminary." "Well, didn't he ever mention that?" Julia asked, her voice shaky. Ray didn't answer immediately. "Curran's record isn't clean. He was investigated twice for misconduct. Nothing ever stuck, but the center shut down not long after. He hasn't been seen in nearly a decade." Julia stared at the photo again, now with a growing sense of dread. If Ethan had kept this hidden, it meant something, and if he'd gone missing just after accessing a large sum of cash and potentially retrieving a map tied to his past, then she feared the connection wasn't coincidence. Ray leaned forward slightly. "There's one more thing, Mrs. Harper. We searched the church's donation ledger. There was an unrecorded outgoing donation in cash 3 weeks ago, $1,500, 0 cents. No recipient listed. Ethan authorized it." Julia closed her eyes. Her husband was a man of routine, transparency, principle. None of this fit, yet here it was. Back at home that night, Julia dug through Ethan's sermon archives, hoping to find some mention of Curran, the center, or even the mountains from the map Gerald had mentioned. She found nothing directly naming Curran, but one sermon from early autumn included a passage that made her pause. "Sometimes what you bury in the past doesn't stay buried. The truth has a habit of rising, even when your heart would rather it didn't." The line wasn't underlined, but something about it felt personal. She copied the sermon and highlighted the passage. Then, on impulse, she called her son. Their youngest, Matt, had always had a knack for digging through online archives. If anyone could find more about James Curran, it was him. She explained the photo, the map, the donation. There was a long pause on the other end. "I'll look into it, Mom," Matt finally said, "but if Dad really is chasing something from that place, I'm not sure we want to know what it is." Julia didn't answer. The house creaked around her as the night deepened, and outside the wind carried the sharp rustle of winter leaves against the window glass. In the study, the photo of the two men lay face down on the desk, and under it the faint outline of a crease, folded paper perhaps, barely visible through the glass panel. Detective Ray Leland's next lead came not from digital records or institutional files, but from a man society often ignored. His name was Tommy Reese, a longtime fixture in the shadows of Greystone. Tommy had lived behind the old community hall 2 blocks from St. Jude's Church for over a decade, surviving on handouts, odd jobs, and the quiet grace of a town that mostly pretended not to see him. But Tommy saw everything. He was the eyes and ears of the alleys and parking lots, a silent witness to the mundane and the strange. When Julia Harper's search for answers went public and the Reverend's disappearance reached the local news cycle, Tommy came forward. He walked straight into the police station, coat frayed, eyes bloodshot, and said, "I saw your pastor that night. He wasn't alone." At first, Ray took the statement as another attention-seeking story. But then Tommy offered details no one could have known. "It was real late," he said, scratching the side of his neck, "round 3, maybe a bit after. I was curled up behind the utility shed across from the church. You know the spot? Where the fence has that gap? Anyway, I woke up 'cause I heard wheels, not the little kind either, heavy wheels. Luggage." Ray leaned forward. "What did you see?" "Your preacher," Tommy answered. "He came out the side entrance, dragging a suitcase. Same one you talked about on TV. He was moving quick, like not his usual self. Kept looking around. Then this SUV rolls up, black, tinted windows, nice rims, quiet engine. Not the kind of car he drives, but I saw him open the back. They talked for a sec, couldn't hear what they said. Then he loaded the bag in, got in the passenger seat, and they drove off down Maple. Real slow." Ray's instincts twitched. There were no reports of an SUV in the vicinity that night, no traffic cams caught it, and Ethan Harper had no known connections to such a vehicle. "You're sure it was him?" "I may be broke, Detective," Tommy replied, tapping his temple. "But my eyes still work." "It was your preacher." Ray logged the statement, flagged it for follow-up, and sent patrol to comb the route the SUV supposedly took. They found nothing. No trace, no tire marks, just silence. That same afternoon, Ray attended a quiet gathering at the church, a scheduled board meeting now turned crisis session. Inside the fellowship hall, the air was thick with tension. Congregants sat with folded hands and nervous eyes, murmuring among themselves. Deacon Willard opened the floor with a prayer that felt more like a plea, and then discussion turned to the Reverend's state of mind in the weeks before his disappearance. That's when Martha Lowell spoke up. A reserved woman in her 60s with silver curls and sharp eyes, Martha had served in the church for over 20 years. "I think Ethan was afraid," she said quietly. All eyes turned to her. 3 weeks ago, we were closing up after Wednesday prayer group, and he asked me a strange question. Said something like, "Do you believe some truths should remain buried?" I laughed it off, thought he was being metaphorical. But he didn't smile. He looked pale, like someone haunted. Then he said, "Some things, Martha, some things are better left undiscovered. We dig, and we think we're uncovering God's plan, but sometimes—" Her words settled over the group like ash. Ray's mind ticked through timelines. 3 weeks ago would place Ethan's anxiety right around the time he made the unrecorded cash donation and, presumably, started pulling together whatever escape or expedition he was now on. After the meeting, Ray pulled Martha aside and asked if Ethan had mentioned anything specific. She hesitated, then said, "Just one phrase." He said, "The mountain keeps its secrets for a reason." I thought he meant it poetically, you know, as a metaphor for trials or faith. But now... She trailed off. Ray didn't need her to finish the sentence. He returned to the church office afterward, using the spare key provided by Deacon Willard. The room still smelled faintly of incense and wood polish, untouched since Gerald had discovered the missing map. Ray turned his attention to the bookshelf. Most of it was theological, sermons, devotionals, Bibles in various translations. But tucked in the corner was a short row of secular material, local histories, travel guides, a thin manual titled Remote Structures and Trail Cabins of the Lower Adirondacks. Ray pulled it out. Inside, pages were dog-eared. One chapter discussed decommissioned ranger outposts from the 1970s, most inaccessible now, forgotten by all but the most experienced hikers. One location, McAllister Hollow, was underlined in red pen, the same type found in the drawer earlier. A marginal note read simply, "Curran, verify access route." That name again, James Curran, the man in the photo, the link between past and present. Ray copied the page and left the book in place. That evening he drove to Julia's house. She answered in a cardigan and slippers, weary but alert. "I have more," he said, stepping into the hallway. Over tea he relayed what Tommy Reese had seen and what Martha Lowell had heard. Julia didn't cry. She just stared at the floor and whispered, He knew he was being watched. Ray asked if Ethan had ever expressed regret about his past work. Julia nodded slowly. Sometimes, especially about that place in the mountains. He said it changed him, said he left something there he wished he could forget. Like what? Ray pressed, but Julia just shook her head. He never told me, only that if it ever surfaced again, it'd ruin everything. Ray left that night more troubled than before. A missing pasture, a map SUV, a map to a forgotten place, a name from the past, and now a warning. Some things shouldn't be unearthed, but Ethan had dug anyway. Whatever he was chasing, it had begun long before that night, and someone, maybe multiple people, were helping him do it. After piecing together the fragments, an old photo, a missing map, whispered confessions, and a name that refused to fade, Detective Ray Leland knew the next step wasn't forward, but backward. He ordered his team to follow up on Ethan Harper's life before Greystone, specifically a house in Fairbrook, the quiet rural town where Ethan had lived nearly a decade earlier, before being assigned to St. Jude's. The property had since remained unsold, technically still under Ethan's name, but unoccupied, a holdover from a chapter he had seemingly left behind. Local realtors said he refused to list it. Too much memory in those walls, one neighbor recalled. The home sat off a winding road, half hidden by overgrown brush and slanted pine. A single gravel path led to a sagging porch and flaking white siding. The grass was dead. The mailbox rusted. Yet when Ray and Officer Marla Jenkins arrived late that Thursday morning, something about the place didn't feel abandoned. The curtains in one room, just one, had been drawn shut from the inside. Marla noticed it first and motioned Ray toward the front door. It was locked, but the old brass knob showed smudges, fresh ones, suggesting it had been touched recently. Inside, the air was thick and moving me, the smell of dust, faint mold, and wood rot curling through the entry hall. They moved cautiously, each creak of the floorboards beneath their boots raising the hair on the back of Ray's neck. The house was mostly empty, stripped of furniture save for a few stacked chairs in the dining room and an old armchair by the fireplace. But it was the door to the basement that caught Ray's attention. It was slightly ajar, and a trail of fine debris ran from the top step downward. He pulled out his flashlight and led the descent. The basement was colder than expected, dry but stagnant. Along the far wall, an old mattress lay directly on the concrete floor, a thin, rolled sleeping bag folded neatly on top. Next to it stood a small battery-powered lantern, still warm when touched. Nearby sat a half-empty bottle of water, a wrapper from a protein bar, and a stack of yellowing notebooks bound with twine. The dust patterns around the mattress were inconsistent, some areas disturbed, others left untouched, indicating movement within the past 24 to 48 hours. Someone had been living here, hiding, and possibly only just left. Ray knelt beside the notebooks, gloved hands flipping gently through the first one. Most of the pages were blank, but several had scribbled notes, some legible, others fragmented. Phrases like, "Can't let them find it," "Check the lower ridge," "Current equals contact," were repeated. The handwriting matched samples from Ethan's church documents. There was no mistaking it. Ethan had been here, and he had returned recently. Upstairs, Marla called out from the hallway bathroom. "Ray, you need to see this." The detective climbed the stairs and joined her. She stood at the entrance to the small bathroom off the main hallway, her flashlight pointed at the bathtub. Inside sat a large black suitcase, nearly identical to the one seen in the church hallway surveillance footage. Ray stepped in slowly, examining it. The suitcase was shut but unlocked. He opened it. Empty. No clothes, no tools, no markings. The lining was clean, too clean. It had been wiped down recently, the fabric almost unnaturally smooth and devoid of dust. No hair fibers, no scuffs, no trace of what had once been inside. Ray reached for his phone and took a few pictures. Marla examined the drain beside the tub, where faint discoloration hinted at recent use. "You think he cleaned it here?" she asked. "Probably," Ray replied. "But why bring it back here? And where's the one he left with?" They searched the rest of the house, closets, attic, crawl spaces, but found no further evidence. Still, the implications were enough. Ethan had used this property as a temporary base, likely in secret. He'd brought the suitcase here after leaving the church, possibly to swap it out. But why leave it empty, cleaned, and placed so conspicuously. Outside, Ray stood on the porch, watching wind stir the dead branches across the yard. The pieces were assembling into a shape, but it was still a blurred silhouette. A man returning to a place he swore never to revisit. A suitcase cleaned to erase something, a mattress in the darkness. Not a man running away, no, this was the behavior of someone preparing. Not a man running away, no, this was the behavior of someone preparing. And yet Ethan had come back to this place, not just physically, but psychologically. Something had pulled him here, back to where it started. Ray instructed forensics to sweep the home. Meanwhile, he sat in the armchair by the fireplace, flipping again through one of the notebooks. One loose sheet slid free. On it, a single sentence, "There is still one more thing in McAllister Hollow." The same place mentioned in the trail cabin book, the same name scribbled beside Curran. A location, a link, a buried truth. Whatever had haunted Ethan Harper wasn't just metaphorical. It was mapped. And it was close. Too close. Ray folded the page and slipped it into his pocket as he turned his eyes toward the horizon, where the mountains loomed faint and foreboding beyond the treetops. The lead from the house in Fairbrook, the hidden mattress, the blank journals, the cryptic message about McAllister Hollow, was barely a day old when Detective Ray Leland's phone rang with a tip from over 700 miles away. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman named Lorraine Dupree, a waitress at a roadside diner in El Paso, Texas. Her tone was hesitant but firm as she said, "I think I saw the man you're looking for. I didn't know at first, but then his face showed up on the news this morning." Ray listened carefully as she explained the encounter. "It was 2 nights ago," she said, "around 1:30 in the morning. He came in with a young woman, maybe 20, give or take. Real quiet, sat in the booth by the window. Didn't order much, just coffee, eggs, toast, but I remember him because he kept looking around like he expected someone to come through the door any second." Ray asked about the girl. Lorraine recalled she had dark hair pulled into a messy braid, wore a hoodie and jeans, and spoke softly with a northern accent. "She did most of the ordering," Lorraine added. "He barely said a word, just nodded, stared out the window. But he tipped well. Cash. And before they left, he wiped down the table with one of our napkins. I thought it was strange. Most folks don't do that." Ray took down the details, and within the hour, his team requested security footage from the diner. When the grainy video file came through, the figure that stepped into view was blurry, but unmistakable. The posture, the gait, even the way he cradled the steaming coffee mug in both hands. It was Ethan Harper. The timestamp confirmed the sighting. 2 days after the suitcase was found in Fairbrook, he had somehow traveled across the country undetected. More troubling than his sudden reappearance was the presence of the girl. She wasn't someone from church records. Julia didn't recognize her. No youth group member, no family friend, no former congregant matched the description. Whoever she was, Ethan was protecting her, or being protected by her. As Ray played the footage again, something else gnawed at him. Ethan's eyes, though unfocused, seemed locked on the camera for a brief second, as if he knew it was there. Not an accident. A message, maybe. Or a warning. The next development arrived in the form of a tech alert. For weeks, Ethan's phone had been dead, powered off, untraceable. Then, without warning, it pinged a cell tower for exactly 3 minutes at 2:42 a.m. in the same night as the El Paso sighting. The tower stood near a desolate stretch of desert less than 10 miles from the U.S.-Mexico border, not far from an old freight crossing no longer in regular use. By the time agents responded, the signal was gone. The phone had been switched off again, battery removed or destroyed. Ray stared at the coordinates on the map. There were no major roads, no hotels, no rest stops within walking distance. Just brush, dry dirt, and ghost trails. The location was deliberate, far from public cameras, far from anyone who might interfere. A place someone would go if they didn't want to be found. Ray sent agents to canvass the area. They found faint tire tracks but no vehicle. No campsites, no belongings, just the shell of a burnt-out RV nearly half a mile from the tower, its chassis rusted, stripped of anything useful. Local border patrol confirmed the area was sometimes used by smugglers or undocumented travelers, but in this case, no recent crossings had been flagged. Still, the signal confirmed what Ray already suspected. Ethan wasn't just fleeing, he was running with a purpose. And he wasn't alone. Back in Greystone, Julia sat in her living room with the diner footage frozen on the TV screen. She stared at the young woman seated across from her husband, studying the curve of her cheek, the tilt of her head, the shape of her eyes. Something about her felt familiar. "She looks like someone," she whispered, almost to herself. When Ray pressed, she shook her head. "I don't know, maybe I'm imagining it, but there's a softness in her face. Ethan used to say his sister had that look. I never met her. She died young, before we met. But if I had to guess, I'd say this girl's family." Ray noted the possibility. If Ethan had discovered a long-lost relative, or believed he had, it could explain his erratic behavior. It could also explain why he went to such lengths to hide her. The question remained, why now? What had changed that made him abandon everything? That night, Ray reviewed the notebook pages recovered from the basement. One phrase kept recurring, "She doesn't know." It appeared 7 times, always isolated on the page, not they, not we, just Shu. Was it the girl? Someone else? A cryptic reminder? In a separate entry, another sentence read, "Keep her safe, no matter the cost." Ray tapped his pen against the desk, frustration growing. Every answer opened 2 new questions. If Ethan had stumbled upon this girl's identity recently, was it tied to the center in the mountains? To Curran? To McAllister Hollow? One last note caught Ray's attention. A date, scratched faintly in the margin, was circled, March 12, just 5 days away. No context, no explanation. But circled 3 times with a question mark beside it. Something was coming. Something planned, and if Ethan had crossed the country, dragging secrets, maps, and a girl with him, it meant whatever was going to happen was connected to the very thing he had once vowed to bury forever. Ray didn't sleep that night. He stared at the map pinned to his wall, eyes locked on the distant ridge where McAllister Hollow was marked. A forgotten trail, a missing counselor, a scared pastor, and a young girl whose face haunted Julia's memory. It all pointed there, to that place in the woods, to what Ethan feared would one day be unearthed. Detective Ray Leland stood over the examination table in the forensics lab, the stark fluorescent lights above casting sharp angles on the sleek black suitcase retrieved from Ethan Harper's former home. It was the second such suitcase, tied to the missing pasture, the first seen on camera, this one physically recovered, and though its surface was unmarked to the casual eye, the lab tech had just shown him something crucial. Under ultraviolet light, embossed faintly on the bottom seam, barely perceptible through years of wear, was a line of text. Permission to sense Red Pines was synonymous with something darker. The name meant nothing to most people. The center had closed over 2 decades ago and vanished into legal oblivion. But to Ray, and to a handful of others who remembered the scandal, Red Pines was synonymous with something darker, abuse allegations, disappearances, internal cover-ups, stories that once made regional headlines before dying out under legal settlements and quiet threats. Most of the staff had dispersed. A few went to prison. Most records were sealed, and Ethan Harper, he had been listed in one old volunteer log as a spiritual advisor, his involvement technically minor, but now impossible to dismiss. Ray pulled the suitcase closer and studied the lettering again. It had been carefully rubbed down, erased to the eye, but the center's name still lived in the fibers. Why keep a piece of luggage from that place? Why now? And more urgently, was this suitcase the same one seen on camera at the church, or a decoy? The forensic team confirmed the lining had trace residue of adhesive, possibly from documents or packaging materials, once stored inside. No DNA. No blood, just a lingering hint of industrial cleanser and something harder to define. Burnt paper, maybe. Ray left the lab in silence, thoughts colliding. The connection to Red Pines reopened a chapter Ethan had never spoken of, and for the first time, it no longer felt like Ethan was running from a mistake. He was chasing something tied to that place. Later that evening, Ray met Julia Harper at the precinct to update her on the discovery. When he mentioned Red Pines, her face went slack with shock. "He never talked about it," she said quietly. "I knew he did some kind of chapel almost work, but I thought it was at a hospital." He always changed the subject when I asked. She paused, then added, "There was one time, about 5 years ago, I remember him getting a letter. He opened it and just stared at it. Then he tore it up and burned it in the sink. I asked what it was, and he said, 'A mistake trying to come back.'" I didn't press. Ray's jaw clenched. The timing matched an internal inquiry he had read once, someone trying to relaunch a lawsuit against Red Pines that was later dropped due to lack of evidence. Maybe that letter had been connected. But the bigger revelation came not from Ethan's past, but from a missing persons file buried in the Greystone police archives. The girl's name was Lily Morton, 17 years old, vanished 6 weeks ago, a runaway, or so it had seemed. No forced entry, no struggle, just a locked bedroom window and a note that read, "I have to know the truth." Her file had been marked inactive. But a week earlier, when Ray first read it, something about the handwriting in the note had felt off. Mature, deliberate, almost guided. Now, with Red Pines in the equation, he requested her sealed juvenile file and found what he feared. Lily had once been a patient at Red Pines. Transferred there at age 8 under a temporary care order. Discharged 2 years later when the center was shut down. No known family since. She'd bounced between foster homes until finally landing in Greystone through a transitional housing program. And the clincher? She'd been attending church at St. Jude's for the past 6 months. Ethan knew her. Ray stared at her intake photo. Young, frightened, dark hair, intense eyes. The same eyes as the girl in the diner footage. Julia confirmed it the moment she saw the picture. "That's her," she whispered. "That's the girl he was with." It all clicked then. Lily wasn't a random runaway. She wasn't a burden Ethan had picked up in desperation. She was part of the past he had buried, alive, walking, asking questions. Ray dug deeper. He found a note in Lily's counseling log written by the church's youth outreach coordinator 2 months prior. Lily is asking more about her time at Red Pines. Seems fixated on a cabin she can't remember clearly. Mentions the man with the cross who never came back. The man was Ethan. She had recognized him. Maybe not immediately, but over time, the pieces had returned. And once she started pressing for the truth, Ethan had been forced to choose. Deny her or help her uncover what had been erased. Ray called the state archives and requested any remaining unsealed documentation from Red Pines. Most had been destroyed, but one file came through, a list of patients who had been flagged at risk in the final months before closure. Lily's name appeared beside a red asterisk. So did another, Hannah Curran, the counselor from Ethan's old photograph. The trail was circular. The girl was seeking the truth. The pasture was leading her toward it, and somewhere in that tangled history, a second girl, possibly Ethan's own blood, had vanished without a trace. Ray stood at the station's evidence board, now cluttered with photos, maps, and string. The suitcase, the house in Fairbrook, the church, McAllister Hollow, Lily, Red Pines. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. Ethan hadn't lost control. He was trying to right something, a sin, a silence, maybe even a promise. But in doing so, he had crossed a line. And now, somewhere out there, past cell towers and state lines, 2 people were walking toward a place no one had returned from in 20 years. The more Detective Ray Leland pulled at the threads surrounding Reverend Ethan Harper, the more the tapestry of his reputation unraveled, revealing a man whose past was not merely forgotten, but carefully concealed. After the discovery of the Red Pine suitcase and confirmation that the girl in the diner was indeed Lily Morton, a former patient and now a missing person connected to Ethan, Ray pressed the State Juvenile Justice Department for full access to historical complaint logs from the defunct center. Most of the documents had long been redacted or destroyed, but one aging clerk, sympathetic and quietly disturbed by what she'd heard on the news, sent over a confidential summary from the final months before the facilities shut down. It included a list of internal incident reports that had never reached trial. One in particular, dated late fall 2003, bore the heading, "Unauthorized Removal, Monitored Subject Matter, Subject to Hannah." The staff notes were fragmented, but one line stood out in bold. "Last seen with volunteer chaplain Ethan Hayes." Ray's eyes narrowed. Beneath that line, handwritten and faint from fax distortion, another note read, "No concrete evidence. Staff cleared. Harper denied involvement. The name matched Hannah, the same girl who appeared in the Red Pines risk roster, the same name on the page beside Lily's. But no one had followed up after the center's collapse. No missing persons report, no further inquiry. As far as the system was concerned, Hannah had never officially existed beyond those walls. The realization hit Ray with grim clarity. Ethan hadn't just known about the abuse, he'd intervened. 1. He'd helped a child escape, and for that, he'd nearly been ruined. From then on, he'd learned to stay quiet, bury the past, serve the church. Until Lily resurfaced, dragging the truth back into the light. The breakthrough led Ray to authorize a deep-ground scan of St. Jude's property. It wasn't uncommon in missing persons cases for key evidence to end up hidden in places no one thought to look, and the church grounds offered multiple concealed sites. They focused first on the area behind the cemetery fence, a stretch of unpaved soil that had seen little disturbance in decades. Late that Friday afternoon, the ground-penetrating radar team signaled a find. 2 feet beneath the surface, obscured by roots and layers of hardened dirt, was a buried object the size of a small suitcase. It was extracted carefully, the metal casing dented and rusted at the corners, but still intact. Once at the station, the team opened it under forensics protocol. Inside, folded with deliberate care, lay a black clergy robe, Ethan's, verified by its embroidered initials and the unique patch stitched on the inside hem from a mission trip in Nicaragua. Beneath the robe, wrapped in a zippered pouch, was a USB flash drive. No dust, no water damage. Ray plugged it into the evidence room computer, heart hammering. The drive contained a single folder titled Truth_304, referencing perhaps the date of Ethan's withdrawal at the ATM, or something deeper. Inside were a series of video clips, time-stamped from various years, all covertly recorded. The first video, grainy and poorly lit, showed a narrow cabin interior. A teenage girl, later confirmed to be Hannah, sat on a cot, hugging her knees. Her voice trembled as she said, "He said if I told anyone, he'd make me disappear like the others." The recording cut off abruptly, followed by several audio files of whispered confessions, conversations in low tones, staff members from Red Pines, voices mostly male, speaking in code about punishments, transfers, and nighttime removals. One video featured Ethan himself, seated before a small camera, looking worn, older than he had in real life. "I'm recording this in case anything happens," he said, his voice steady. "They always said no one would believe us. But I saw what they did. I helped her escape. Her name was Hannah, and she was just a child. I tried to stay away. I tried to serve God and forget. But now Lily's asking the same questions, and I can't stay silent anymore. If you're watching this, it means I failed to stop them again." Ray sat frozen. The evidence was damning, proof not just of past crimes, but of Ethan's personal crusade to reveal them. He hadn't hiding in fear. He'd been building a case, piece by piece, for years, and the moment Lily started remembering, he knew time was running out. Ray ordered the USB contents duplicated and sent for forensic authentication. Meanwhile, he revisited the surveillance footage from the church's hallway, specifically the frame where Ethan returned with the suitcase. Zooming in, enhancing, he now noticed a subtle patch on the handle, a faint square where a sticker or tag had once been. It matched the indentation on the Red Pine suitcase found in Fairbrook. That meant Ethan had transferred its contents into this buried one. Why? To hide it? Or to pass it along? That evening, Ray returned to the church cemetery alone, flashlight in hand. He walked past the burial plot where the suitcase had been found, to the far edge where the ground dipped slightly. Something about that area called to him. The wind was sharp and cold, rustling the brittle grass, and the moonlight cast long shadows between the headstones. He stood silently, imagining Ethan here in the dead of night, digging, sweating, burying a truth no one else wanted to carry. But he hadn't buried it out of shame. He'd buried it because he knew the danger, knew that if it fell into the wrong hands, the trail would disappear again. Ray turned back toward the church, the outline of its steeple a dark triangle against the sky. He knew what he had to do. He had to find Lily, and he had to find McAllister Hollow, because buried in those woods wasn't just Ethan's past. It was the key to understanding what had happened to those girls, what the center had hidden, and what Ethan had tried, desperately, to bring into the light before it was too late. Detective Ray Leland sat alone in the evidence review room, the harsh light above him casting long shadows across the metal table where the USB drive lay beside his notepad. He took a slow breath before pressing play on the next file, an audio recording marked simply, Confession_Final. The audio clicked alive with a faint static hiss, then the unmistakable sound of Ethan Harper's voice filled the room, subdued and deliberate, as if speaking to someone he would never meet. "If this file is playing," Ethan began, "then I've either failed or chosen not to return. Either way, I owe the truth, at least the part I've carried for 20 years. Ray leaned closer, the weight of Ethan's tone pressing down on him. Red Pines was never just a place for troubled kids. It was a place where people like me, young, idealistic, naive, were brought in to legitimize something rotten. I was a seminary intern. I thought I was helping, but I didn't see it until too late." He paused, the silence on the recording stretching. Then his voice returned, more raw this time. "Over 2 years, I met dozens of girls. Most were quiet, angry, bruised on the inside in ways I couldn't begin to understand. But 3 stood out. Hannah the first, sharp-witted, defiant, with eyes that dared you to lie to her. I helped her escape. I knew it was illegal. I knew they'd come after me. But I couldn't watch them hurt her again. We used the back trail, the one through the maintenance tunnel no one patrolled. I drove her to a safe house in Vermont and never looked back." Ray scribbled furiously in his notes, the implications of what he was hearing expanding with every sentence. Ethan continued, "The second was Mary. She didn't speak for weeks, but when she did, it was about the others, girls who vanished in the night, whose names were struck from records. I got her out the same way, but after Mary, I was watched, closely. That's when I knew they suspected me." Another pause. Then Ethan's voice cracked. "The third was Aliena. She was 15, small, curious, always asking why. I tried to get her out. I planned it for weeks, but the night we were supposed to leave, she never showed up. I waited 3 hours. The next morning, she was gone. Staff said she was transferred. I knew what that meant. I never saw her again." Ray clenched his jaw, the truth heavy in his chest. Ethan had tried, and he had failed. One girl lost, erased. Ethan's voice grew softer. "For years I told myself I did what I could, that 2 lives saved was more than most. But the guilt never left. I left the ministry. I married Julia. I served in peace. Until one night, last winter, a young woman joined our church group. Her name was Lily." There was a long pause. A chair creaked in the background. She had Alina's eyes. Ray froze. "At first I thought I was seeing things, a coincidence. But Lily started asking questions. About her childhood, about a center she couldn't fully remember, about someone she called the man with the cross. I didn't want to believe it, but she showed me a photo, torn, stained, from a back she found in her foster home. Alina was in it. So was I. And on the back, scribbled in faint ink, was a date. 9 months before Lily was born. Ray felt his throat tighten. Ethan's voice continued, hoarse now. "I never knew, I swear it, but when I saw that photo, something broke in me. I realized that Lily was mine, that somehow in that awful place, something had happened, something beyond my control. And now she was back, not knowing who she was or why she couldn't forget a place she was never meant to remember." The recording shifted slightly, as if Ethan had stood up, then sat back down. "I couldn't let her go through it alone. I couldn't let them take her or silence her. She wanted the truth. She deserved it. I dug up the old maps, the logs, the videos I kept in secret. I showed her everything. And I told her who I was. She didn't believe me at first, but she didn't walk away." Ray's heart pounded. The pieces were finally aligning. If Ethan hadn't kidnapped Lily, he'd revealed himself. And she'd chosen to follow. Ethan's voice trembled in the next sentence. "I don't know what's waiting for us at McAllister Hollow. Maybe nothing. Maybe the last piece of the story. But if we make it, if someone finds this, please tell Julia I'm sorry. I never meant to disappear. I just couldn't let my daughter carry this weight alone." The recording ended with the soft clink of the USB being placed back into its case. Ray sat in stunned silence, the confession echoing in his mind. Ethan had spent decades burying guilt, hiding from his past, and in the end had uncovered a secret that shattered every boundary between right and wrong, father and stranger. He had loved a girl, then lost her. And now, years later, he was trying to save the daughter he never knew he had, from a truth she had already begun to chase on her own. Ray leaned back in his chair, the flickering screen before him displaying the final line of the audio file's transcript. Some debts can't be repaid, but truth deserves a witness. He closed the file, pocketed the drive, and picked up the phone to call his team. If Ethan and Lily were still alive, they would be heading to the one place Ethan had written about again and again, McAllister Hollow. Ray checked the weather. A storm was rolling in by morning. The window to reach them was closing fast. By the end of the second week, with snow beginning to thaw across the upper ridge of McAllister Hollow and the USB confession reviewed and confirmed by federal authorities, the case of Reverend Ethan Harper reached national headlines. But for Detective Ray Leland, the story hadn't ended with the last audio file or the buried suitcase. There were still missing pieces. Chief among them, where had Ethan gone, and was Lily truly safe? Homeland Security flagged a development 3 days after the confession reached Washington. A border crossing in Laredo, Texas, captured low-resolution surveillance footage of a man passing through secondary checkpoint screening under the name Marcus Clay, a Colombian passport issued via Caracas. The image quality wasn't ideal, but when run through facial comparison software, the match came back at 87%, high enough to warrant interest. More compelling than the match, however, was the appearance of the man. Younger-looking, clean-shaven, with something about his posture, the way he tucked his chin down as he passed the agent, was unmistakable. When Ray compared it side by side with an old photo of Ethan Harper from seminary 23 years ago, right before he began at Red Pines, the resemblance was undeniable. The man who crossed the border had walked with purpose, alone, head low, passport tight in hand. By the time the flag went active, he had already cleared the last customs checkpoint in Bogota, destination unknown. 3 weeks later, Julia Harper received a package with no return address. It arrived by courier, weather-warm and wrapped in plain paper, bearing only her name and the phrase, "Forward from Consulado de Cartagena." Inside was a small box. She opened it on the kitchen table, her hands trembling, heart pounding with the weight of 1,000 small salt water and dried parchment. And the letter. A single page, folded neatly, written in familiar handwriting. No date, no greeting, just the truth. Julia, I'm sorry I couldn't say goodbye the right way, but if you're reading this, then it means we made it out. Lily is safe. She knows now. She understands. We crossed together, and I watched her disappear into the crowd, new papers in hand, tears on her face. She's strong, stronger than I ever was. She's headed for school finally, somewhere they'll never ask where she came from. I gave her everything I had, my name, my story, even the truth about Alana. She deserved all of it, and for once in my life, I gave it without hiding. I cannot return. Not because I don't want to, but because I'm done running. And I need the world to believe I'm gone, so she never has to look over her shoulder again. Tell Matt I love him. Tell the congregation I tried. I really did. And Julia, thank you for loving me even through the silence. Yours always, Ethan. Beneath the letter was a small photograph, recent, candid. Lily stood on a boardwalk with the ocean behind her, wind in her hair, eyes squinting against the sun. Beside her, slightly blurred, Ethan turned mid-law, looking healthier, younger even, than in his final sermons. Julia pressed the photo to her chest, silent tears falling. It wasn't closure, but it was something close. Something warmer than a grave, more permanent than a goodbye. In the days that followed, the congregation mourned, divided between grief and quiet reverence. Some felt betrayed, others called him a martyr. But those who knew him best, like Martha Lowell and Gerald the groundskeeper, spoke only of a man haunted by the past who chose, in the end, not to run from it, but to walk straight through it, to making someone else's burden so they wouldn't have to. Detective Ray Leland filed his final report 2 months later. The case remained technically open, no body, no arrest, but for all practical purposes, It was over. The suitcase, the confession, the border footage, all painted the same picture. A man who refused to remain complicit, even if it meant destroying everything he had built. Ray kept a copy of the USB on his desk, not for evidence, but as a reminder that some truths don't stay buried, and that sometimes justice looks like letting go. The story drifted into memory, then into legend. Some said Ethan Harper started a new church in the Colombian highlands under another name. Others believed he lived in silence, tending a remote garden, a man finally at peace. But Julia kept the photo on her mantle, the letter tucked into her Bible, between pages worn with grief and grace. And when asked by visitors what became of her husband, she would smile softly and say, "He went looking for a girl who was lost, and in saving her, he found himself." If this story kept you hooked, make sure to like and subscribe for more real-life inspired mysteries just like it. What part of Ethan Harper's journey shocked you the most? Do you think he made the right choice in the end? And where in the world are you watching from? Drop your thoughts and location in the comments. We read every one.